Hi, I'm Shelly Knotts. I'm currently an independent artist and researcher, and I'm going to talk about my talk's called Punk Programming, Appropriating Riot Grrrl in the Algorithmic Age, and I'm going to talk about a specific live coding project that I worked on a couple of years ago, and I sort of keep resurrecting it every now and again. Just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the musical subcultures of Riot Grrrl and Algorave, and then some issues around data bias in AI and music information retrieval, how that sort of formed into a punk programming practice, and then my piece, which is sort of an attempt at approaching algorithmic Riot Grrrl music. So this is a project that I worked on while I was a researcher on the Mimic project, which Tom mentioned, which was a sort of 3 university collaboration looking at developing tools for the creative exploration of machine listening and machine learning. And I was specifically working on the machine applications of the machine listening tools that we were working on. The project is obviously very heavily influenced by my practice as part of the Algorave scene. And as I'm not really sure who the audience is here, Algorave is a practice which sort of evolved out of the live coding scene. So live coding is a form of music making where the performers program music live on stage or visuals or other art forms. And Algorave kind of emerged out of that in around 2012 and is about live coded dance music parties. And I've sort of been involved in that scene since around 2012 when it started. And I always say I'm kind of an accidental algoraver because I never really intended to make dance music. It just kind of came through the practice and through working things out on stage. So my background is more as a sort of experimental music maker. I sort of learned how to make dance music on the job, as it were. The project's also kind of informed by my interest in how Algorave and gender interact and sort of how the female body is implicated by this very highly technological performance style. To give you a bit of background on these 2 subcultures that are sort of crossed over in this project, Riot Grrrl is a sort of explicitly feminist punk music from around the early 1990s. And it emerged around the same time as hardcore punk music, which was a very male-dominated scene. And was often very misogynistic, and women who'd previously been involved in punk music movements found that obviously didn't really speak to them. So they wanted to make punk music that spoke to female relevant themes and to their own experiences that weren't covered by the sort of more dominant hardcore punk music. And so it's really about women kind of seizing this means of producing music to make explicitly feminist punk music. And they were organizing themselves through zines and writing and local meetings. And a lot of the themes that came through this Riot Grrrl music were then later sort of commodified and marketized and appropriated by the sort of girl power movement of the mid-1990s that sort of turned that into sellable pop music. This is bands like the Spice Girls and others from around that time. And then on the sort of other side, we have Algorave, which I already mentioned sort of grew out of the live coding scene. And I find Algorave like super interesting from a cultural perspective in the way that it took algorithmic music, which would more often, till that point, potentially have been seen in sort of academic circles to the dance floor and to this very public space of sort of clubs and club scenes. And sort of shifted it to being much more accessible and sort of including practitioners who wouldn't necessarily have access to sort of the academic spaces where live coding was happening before. And yeah, sort of through the sort of process of moving out and into new spaces and new genres. So Algorave has always had a very sort of DIY music ethos. Live coding sort of has some relation to the open software movements. And it's sort of traditionally been very experimental in the way that it deals with dance music and sort of pushes forms, limits, and processes. And probably most fundamentally for me, it's a very human-centric technological practice. So it's very much about the human on stage and their interaction with these algorithmic processes that are being written and reformed in the moment. And sort of foregrounds through the presentation, which usually involves projecting the code as part of the performance, foregrounds how the performer is interacting with the code and interacting with the output of the code, and sort of sitting in this feedback loop between formalizing ideas, writing ideas, hearing the result, and changing them according to that. Yeah, Algorave is also not very strictly defined. So apart from the fact that it's generally about dance music, there's no other real strict limit on what an Algorave can or should be, apart from a sort of strong commitment to diversity. So it kind of is in the guidelines for Algorave that it shouldn't be all white male lineups, but it isn't in the guidelines what kind of music should be played or like how that should be presented. So I also find that like a really interesting way of thinking about a community. And yeah, as a performer, one of the features of Algorave and live coding that I find particularly interesting is this sort of consistent experience as a performer of sort of public failure. So when you're live coding, you're dealing with sort of unstable systems, unstable code, you're writing the code on stage, and there's very a lot of space for things to go wrong. You know, if you're typing code quickly, you can often like type something slightly wrong and the code doesn't run, or more catastrophically, it might make a terrible noise or crash your computer and stuff like that. So these are all things that can and do happen during live coding or Algorave performance. Yeah, over a long period of sort of performing with live coding and experimenting with this, I became really interested in how those sort of like errors and failures are an important structuring device. So they very often like change the course of a performance. Either on a micro level that you end up with something that you weren't quite expecting and end up following a different thread, or maybe you have like a crash in the middle of the performance and you have to find a way to restart the performance, which might take it in a very different direction. And yeah, I guess I'm also interested in that from the sort of like political perspective of the performative act of failure or failure with technology. So because we're projecting our screen, you can often see if someone's got stuff going wrong, there might be like a big bit of text that comes on the screen saying error or like flashing red or something like that. So it's very obvious when things are going wrong, and you often the sort of human response to that is very clear, that they're trying to like fix something, or like the music isn't moving forward because you've got like a typographical error in the code, for example. yeah, I kind of like how this aspect of live coding maybe or this aspect of very publicly failing as coding gives a kind of new perspective also to technology more broadly. So the sort of anti-techno heroic narrative of like coding is very failure prone, and humans who write code aren't like fallible or like, you know, geniuses who know everything, but they're just trying to make stuff happen. And Carl Manton failed up this negotiation with error and failure really nicely in, oh, don't have a date from that. It was some press article, I think from 2019. So she said it's live coding is the punk end of electronic music. The best performances are those where you don't know what's going to happen and you get a sense of figuring it out. And this is how I always understand live coding as a performer, is you're kind of getting on stage and you're doing stuff and then you're like working it out in the moment, like how to move forward or like how to make this code run. And yeah, I guess that to me also always like had this like strong connection to sort of punk and DIY aesthetics as well. Yeah, it's sort of easy kind of through that to think of live coding as closer to hacking cultures than necessarily to sort of more highbrow algorithmic music practices. I don't know what that would be right now, but it's not really about creating like a grand algorithmic structure and hearing it run. It's more about doing really simple stuff, writing simple code and breaking things on stage and then finding a way to fix them again. And from a gendered perspective, I've found it really interesting to think about that this performative failure can have a strongly gendered element. So as women in live coding, we're sort of operating in a context in music technology where women's skills are often questioned. Sorry. Just losing my notes here underneath another screen. So yeah, sorry, in the music tech context, women's technical skills are often questioned, and it can feel really strongly political from that context to then participate in a practice where public technical failure is like inevitable. Like it's, you know, when you go into a live coding performance that that's something that's going to happen. And Emma Fox sort of summed this up talking about the techno scene. Saying as women, our legitimacy in tech spaces is called into question and scrutinized more, alongside insinuations about accusations cruising on the novelty of having a female body. When your gender is continually pointed to as an anomaly, whether it's an aberration, a distraction, or a nifty diversity point score, it becomes something that's central to your experience. Yeah, I read this paper and then I found it interesting to think about, well, what does that mean when you're live coding, when you know that you're going to very publicly be showing flaws in technical operation. And yeah, this is something that various people have talked about. So Julie Dawn Smith from the Feminist Improvisation Group from the 1970s also said, as the female body is already a spectacle by virtue of her difference, then making a spectacle of oneself by improvising that difference is a crucial performance of agency. Yeah, so when I was thinking about this kind of stuff, it kind of led me to a space where I started to make work that was explicitly questioning male narratives of technology and foregrounding gender as sort of an essential part of the performance as a female live coder. I don't know, how am I doing for time, Simon? Sorry.
Simon?
I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, you're on the 15-minute mark.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So maybe I'm going to skip over this video, but I'll just describe it briefly instead. So this is a video from Algorave, which is a pop duo I was part of for a few years. Algorave duo, where we were sort of explicitly referencing these sort of 1990s girl band groups through this tongue-in-cheek name. And yeah, this is a performance where essentially like everything went wrong that could possibly go wrong. And even to the point where the sound cut out for a few minutes, and like I was trying to fix it frantically and then made a really horrible sound because like I had to code something. But I just find this a really interesting performance because the audience were like really into it, and it kind of became like more of like a code drama than a music performance. And yeah, I think there was something quite powerful about being sort of a all female group sort of performing this like code failure drama in sort of the British Library in London. But yeah, it's quite a long video, so I'm just going to skip it as I want to have time to talk about the actual piece. So yeah, then I started thinking about I wanted to make a work that explicitly used the corpus of Riot Grrrl music as a way of inserting explicitly feminist narratives and explicitly feminist female voices into the narrative of Algorave. So I started thinking about what a Riot Grrrl, an algorithmic Riot Grrrl, would look like, and some of the sort of problematics around that. So Algorave's quite often talked about as like being very good at gender diversity, which it is compared to lots of parts of the computer music community, but we're still a minority, and we're still working in with this like within this male dominated ecosystem of music technology, and also within an algorithmic frame that's been largely built by men, and erases the feminist history of computing. So I thought maybe I could in some way reclaim a sort of a feminist part of algorithmic art through using or appropriating Riot Grrrl music. Yeah, and I guess that there was also, you know, these echoes of Riot Grrrl in the way that women within the scene have operated. Like we've always sort of had a bit of a sense of solidarity between women in the scene. And last year we sort of explicitly made a group which is called Live Codera, sort of echoing Riot Grrrl organizing and sort of creating power through solidarity and activism. Yeah, this is a little bit of a shift of mode, which I didn't know how to handle very smoothly in this talk. But the piece is using machine listening because I wanted to work with a corpus of material and algorithmically remix it. I wanted to work with machine listening algorithms. Which I thought threw up like a whole other like set of like political things around how you would deal with that in a feminist way. So there's lots of sort of problematics we could talk about around music AI. So for example, often music AI machine learning requires like huge amounts of data to learn how to produce musical forms. And the training of these large models is resource heavy, not viable for a lot of projects. Yeah, and these music information retrieval algorithms are generally like the first step of the music AI process, and they consist of algorithms that quantify perceptual aspects of the audio, such as pitch, timbre, and rhythm. Yeah, and the data that we're using for this is cultural artifacts. But in a lot of music AI projects, you would never really know what data has been used as the input. And when you're dealing with cultural products, I think that can sometimes be problematic. and from the MIR perspective, music information retrieval tends to prioritize easily quantified features such as music in the Western harmonic tradition. Yeah, for me, I was using Riot Grrrl music, which is quite often noisy sound sets that doesn't really conform to sort of easily analyzed melodies and rhythms. And which is sort of interesting musically, because the results you get tend to be more noisy and unpredictable. I think something that's not really talked about enough in MIR is this idea of that the artists whose music is used, although in the last few years there has been a bit more discussion around this, but really artists would have input into how their data is used and repurposed when it's taken and used for sort of like larger scale algorithms. And there's some examples of projects where to circumvent Anglo-American copyright laws, researchers took data from countries that had lesser copyright laws without their knowledge or consent, and they're never compensated or even informed. So yeah, because of this, I wanted to like essentially appropriate a Riot Grrrl corpus as sort of a provocation pointing to the problematics of this. But it's a very atypical data set for an MIR project because it's not so easy to quantify. Which I think is fine. Yeah, and from the practice side, I guess I was thinking about live coding as quite a punk practice. So I've already talked a lot about performative failure being sort of an integral part of practice. So I was thinking about how would I structure this using the punk music, and use that corpus to highlight the lack of women's voices in broader electronic music scenes. Yeah, I tried to like embody a punk development process. So when I made the original piece, I kind of worked on the process for a couple of hours before the show and then just performed it. And I've performed it quite a few times since, and I never practice it, but I sometimes do add new features before a show as a way to sort of like push the process forward or push the piece forward without necessarily like becoming an expert at the piece. Yeah, in short, the piece is about algorithmically remixing Riot Grrrl music, and I'm using a corpus analysis of a database of Riot Grrrl music. And during the piece, I'm using search algorithms, which are both in SuperCollider and in JavaScript, to extract chunks of data, audio data with particular characteristics, so particular feature values from the MIR machine listening algorithms. And then after that, I'm sort of freely improvising with those patterns. So it's kind of like a back and forth between like letting the data inform the material and then using my own practice to then shape the performance in some way. It's deliberately using very simple algorithms. So in SuperCollider, I'm literally like searching for chunks of data with particular feature sets, and then using the patterns library to sequence them in various ways. And in the JavaScript script, I'm essentially drawing trajectories for feature data, and it's sending me back audio loops that then I can change and play with. Yeah, the JavaScript thing has a bit of a bug that it gets stuck on. When you change the trajectories, it gets stuck in an audio sense, and it makes a bit of a glitchy noise, but I kind of kept it in because I liked it from the punk perspective. Yeah. So, I've just got 5 whole minutes left. And I've got a 2-minute video to play, so I'm way ahead of time. I've just got a bit of an example of one of the performances of this to play, and then we can go to questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we have a few minutes of Shelly specific questions before we go to the more general chat. So if anyone has them, please do post them in the chat, or feel free to kind of come on with mic and camera as you prefer, bearing in mind we're still kind of recording at this stage. I get maybe Chair's right of jumping in with first question, and I had kind of 3 I was thinking about, so I'll maybe just try and pick one. I was wondering, is punk programming an established term, or is that something you've kind of been developing, thinking about through this, or is there a history of that, or is that?
I don't know, actually. I should probably look it up. I mean, yeah, it was just like my way of trying to like frame this practice, or trying to think about live coding from a different angle. But yeah, maybe there is an established punk programming thing that I should look up.
I'm not saying that, thinking there is, but
I hate to say it, but you could get a paper at a software engineering conference on the punk development process, no question.
So feel free to put your hand up too if you do have questions. I was also going to ask sort of on that. So it feels like it's hitting this really interesting spot that's maybe not what you'd expect to get at an Algorave. Not that there's any defined expectations, as you say, but I wonder if there's a kind of Algorave performance which is almost sort of beating you over the head with how clever and slick it manages to be from a code perspective, which this is sort of the opposite of, or am I projecting?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting, like, because I mean, maybe this was also like motivated from the perspective that I've been around for a while in the Algorave scene, and when it first started, it did feel like very experimental and maybe like less music that less met the expectations of what you would see in a dance music scene. Whereas over time, I sometimes feel like the music has got more and more well produced in Algorave, or moved more towards more standard dance music forms, which, you know, is fine. But I guess I'm always interested in sort of carving out spaces for like pushing limits and pushing expectations. And for me, I guess live coding is kind of about doing what you wouldn't do with the DAW, or what you wouldn't do in the studio. So yeah, maybe it's also just me being an old grumpy person who's been in the Algorave scene too long, being like, I want more hard to listen to music in Algorave and less standard dance music. But yeah.
That's why I was taken from it. Carola, your hand's up.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued, because while you were playing that, there was a discussion of the fourth wave of HCI, and I was picking up a quote which then fits so much with live coding, this notion, and I'm not an expert in that, so maybe the person can come in to talk about it, but you know, the definition of the fourth wave being also that the implications of making a central concerns rather than, you know, the design of the technology or the user interface as such. And it seems just to me that this emphasis on the implications of making a central concerns fits with live coding, which then got me thinking that, you know, live coding is where sort of the performative cultures clashed with the coding cultures and possibly pushed, now this is my question, the HCI community into the fourth wave, because that's where you push into the doing, the being in that moment, rather than designing ahead and then doing either top-down design or bottom-up design. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it just, you know, I was just thinking it was a very intriguing thought.
Yeah, how to speak to that. Yeah, I guess, yeah, absolutely. Like, I definitely think, I mean, not just me, but lots of people talk about live coding as like an embodied computing practice. So it's very much about like being in the moment and, you know, taking into account the space and the other people in the room, and all of these elements are kind of feeding into then the action of the interaction with the code. So yeah, I guess it's kind of a socialized form of computing in some ways.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
There's
Thank you.
Oh, sorry to jump on top of you. One more question from Morgan in the chat, and then maybe we can transfer to the more general questions. Can you see that, Shelly, or do you want me to read it?
Oh, I don't have the chat open right now.
I'll read it out. So it says, I love this. I'm wondering if you can talk about the the potential tensions you encounter when operating in academic spaces with a punk ethos. Does that tension shape your practice at all?
I don't know, maybe it's shaped my trajectory out of academia. But, yeah. I don't know, I guess maybe I've always operated kind of at the edges of academia, and with a sort of rebellious instinct towards the institutionalization. But yeah, I guess I've always been kind of one foot in research and well, I'm not anymore, but I used to be like one foot in research and academia, and then another foot in being out in the world doing stuff. So yeah, I guess that's where these projects sort of come from, in a way, is like being very committed to the research also being part of the world and not being something that's sort of like locked away and just looked at by other researchers. Yeah, I guess that's what I like about the live coding scene, is it does very much like sit between these two worlds of like thinking about doing something that's new and novel, but also thinking about like relevance and interacting with with the real world as well. I don't know whether that really answered the question at all, but
well, maybe this is a good point to sort of switch over to the generalized discussion. So we normally